out on the Navajo Nation in a stretch of high desert. Nobody bothers driving through unless they live there. A rancher named Tsé Bit'a'í is standing over a boulder that wasn't there yesterday. Not wasn't there in the sense that somebody stole it. It's still sitting right in front of him, half buried in the dry clay, exactly the way it's supposed to. What's wrong is what's behind it. A long, shallow groove cut into the hardpan, running arrow straight for almost 60 feet, ending right at the base of the rock, as if something the size of a washing machine had simply slid across the desert floor on its own. There are no tire tracks, no boot prints, no sign that another human being has been out here in weeks. Just a rock, and the scar it left getting to where it now sits. Tom isn't shocked, he's annoyed. In the specific way you get annoyed at something you've heard about your whole life and finally have to deal with in person. Because this is not the first time a rock has walked on this land, and it will not be the last. His grandfather told him about rocks like this. So did his grandfather's father, most likely, though that part of the story gets a little foggier the further back you go, which, as we're about to find out, might be exactly the point. If you've spent any real time in the American desert Southwest, you've probably heard some version of this before, usually filed under the heading of roadside oddity or roadside attraction. Rocks that move by themselves, trails cut into dry lake beds with no explanation. For most of the 20th century, mainstream science treated this as a curiosity at best and a tall tale at worst, the kind of thing you'd see on a hand-painted sign outside a gas station, right next to the jackalope. Maybe you remember hearing about something like this yourself, decades ago, a grainy photo in a magazine. A mention on a late-night radio program, a relative who swore they'd seen the tracks themselves out past Death Valley and couldn't explain a single one of them. That's usually as far as the story ever traveled for most Americans. A strange photograph, a shrug, and then it got filed away as one of the desert's harmless little oddities and forgotten. Almost nobody ever asked the second. More obvious question, who else had been watching this happen for a lot longer than anyone with a camera had been showing up to look? But on tribal land, this was never treated as a curiosity. It was treated as something closer to a fact of life, understood on its own terms, explained in its own language. And this part is important, almost never explained fully to the outsiders who came asking about it. Because here's what almost nobody outside these communities properly understands. In Diné tradition, Diné being what the Navajo people call themselves, stone was never simply inert material sitting around waiting to be picked up, carved, or built with. Certain formations, certain rocks, certain places where stone meets the desert floor carry a kind of presence that Western science has no real vocabulary for. And when elders were asked directly why a rock would leave a trail across open ground with nothing pushing it, the honest answer wasn't confusion. It was the same answer you'd get if you asked a stranger to explain your own family's private business. Not your concern, not something we hand over on request. Tonight, we're going to look at what was actually behind that silence, the tribal understanding of these living stones, the very real physical trails that geologists have been documenting across the desert Southwest for over a century, and the almost unbelievable amount of time it took outside science to catch up to something native communities had already worked out generations earlier. Because as strange as it sounds, somebody did eventually solve part of this mystery. It just wasn't the first people to encounter it. Not by a long shot. To understand why a moving boulder wasn't treated as a shock on Navajo land, you have to understand something the Diné have known for a very long time. Some of the most sacred formations on this landscape are described, in the oldest stories, as having moved themselves once deliberately and then never again. The most famous example towers 1,500 feet over the desert floor, near the Four Corners, and most people who've driven through that part of New Mexico have seen it without knowing its real name. Outsiders call it Shiprock because 19th century settlers thought its jagged silhouette looked like an old sailing ship cresting the plain. The Diné call it Tsé Bit'a'í, the rock with wings. According to tradition, Tsé Bit'a'í was not always a mountain of stone. It was a great bird, and it once carried the ancestors of the Diné people across the land on its back, searching for a place to settle. When evening came, the bird folded its wings, lowered itself onto the desert floor, and turned to stone permanently, deliberately becoming the mountain that still stands there today. The people who had ridden on its back climbed down to gather food and water, and legend says a storm one day destroyed their path back to the summit, stranding those left above. Now, you can take that story exactly as literal history if you want, or you can take it as a profound piece of geological memory dressed in narrative language, because Shiprock is in cold, hard scientific terms a volcanic plug, the eroded throat of a volcano that was active around 30 million years ago. What's remarkable is how closely the traditional account and the geological one actually line up. A formation that rose violently out of the earth, stood alone against a landscape it didn't originally belong to, and then went permanently dramatically still. Whether you call that a bird settling for the night, or a volcanic neck losing the softer rock around it over millions of years, both versions are describing the same fundamental event, something enormous arriving and then choosing to stop. Either way, the point stands. In Diné understanding, this is not a story about a rock that resembles something alive. It's a story about a living thing that became rock at a specific place, for a specific reason, and once you accept that framework, a boulder leaving a trail across a dry lake bed stops being an anomaly and starts being a much smaller, much more familiar version of something the culture already has a category for. That distinction matters enormously, and it's the exact same distinction we ran into in this channel's earlier work on the strange lights over Navajo land. Outsiders keep mistaking silence for ignorance. What's actually happening is closer to the opposite. The tradition already has language for what's occurring. It simply isn't language that gets handed over casually to a surveyor with a notepad and a government badge. And there's a second layer to this that outside researchers have consistently underestimated. For the Diné, certain stone formations are treated with the same category of respect you'd extend to a person, not an object. There are places on this land where you don't touch the rock, don't remove it, don't disturb the ground around it, not because of superstition, but because the culture assigns those formations a kind of standing that Western property law has no equivalent for. When a settler in, say, 1890 asked a Diné elder to explain a trail of stone marks across a playa, they weren't just asking a factual question about physics. They were asking someone to translate a living relationship into a vocabulary built for dead objects. Small wonder the answer that came back so often amounted to nothing at all. Compare that to how the outside world has historically treated land and stone in this same region. Government surveys measured it, mining companies staked it, railroads cut straight through it, every one of those institutions operating from the assumption that rock was simply raw material waiting for a use. It's not hard to see why a Diné elder in that era would hesitate to hand over a piece of sacred understanding to representatives of exactly the kind of thinking that had already cost the tribe so much of its land. The silence wasn't a failure to communicate. It was a boundary drawn on purpose by people who understood precisely what tended to happen to knowledge once it crossed into the wrong hands. But knowing the framework existed only gets us halfway. The real question is what happened when outside science, generations later, finally got serious about explaining these trails on its own terms, and just how long that actually took. Here's where this story stops being confined to one reservation and becomes one of the strangest unsolved then solved mysteries in 20th century American science. Scattered across the dry lake beds of the desert's southwest flat, cracked expanses of clay known as playas. The most famous sitting inside Death Valley National Park in California, geologists have documented rocks, some weighing hundreds of pounds, that leave long, precise trails across the ground with absolutely no visible cause. This particular playa, known today as Racetrack Playa, sits well outside Navajo land, out toward the California-Nevada line, on ground that belongs to the story of the Timbisha Shoshone people. But the underlying geology, dry lake beds, seasonal flooding, bone-dry clay, baked hard by summer heat, repeats itself again and again across this same broad stretch of the American desert, all the way into the Colorado Plateau country the Diné have called home for centuries. It's the same landscape wearing a different name in every state line it crosses. Some trails run arrow straight for hundreds of feet. Others curve double back or stop dead as if the rock simply changed its mind. Nobody, in over a century of recorded observation, ever actually witnessed one of these stones in the act of moving. That's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. That is the literal scientific record. Researchers surveyed and mapped individual stones for years at a time, naming them, tracking their positions, returning season after season. And the rocks kept relocating themselves in the gaps between visits, leaving their tracks as the only evidence anything had happened at all. One 700-pound stone researchers had nicknamed and tracked for years turned up more than half a mile from where it had last been recorded, having left not one single clue as to how it got there. For decades, the leading theories ranged from strong desert winds to magnetic anomalies to eventually outright supernatural explanation, which, if you think about it, is a remarkable admission from mainstream science. When a phenomenon has stumped researchers long enough, maybe its magic starts creeping back into peer-reviewed conversation, dressed up in more careful language. It wasn't until 214. Think about that number for a second, 214. Well within the lifetime of most people watching this, that a small team combining a planetary scientist, a biologist, and an engineer finally caught the process on camera using GPS trackers and time-lapse photography. The answer turned out to be a precise, almost improbable combination of conditions: a thin layer of rainwater on the playa floor, freezing overnight into a fragile sheet of ice, then breaking apart the next morning under nothing more than an ordinary desert breeze, gently pushing half-floating ice panes and the rocks embedded in them silently across the mud below. No magnetism, no hidden force, just water, ice, and wind, arriving in exactly the right sequence, on exactly the right morning. Rarely enough that almost nobody ever managed to see it happen. Think about the sheer logistics of that discovery for a moment. Researchers had to install a private weather station in one of the most punishing environments in North America. Fit individual rocks with GPS units precise enough to register a shift of a few inches, and then simply wait through blistering summers and freezing desert nights for a specific narrow window of weather to arrive. Rain at exactly the wrong temperature, followed by exactly the right kind of overnight freeze, followed by exactly the right breath of wind the very next morning. Miss that window by even a single season and you're back to waiting. It is by any measure one of the most patient scientific discoveries in modern American history. It took over 100 years, a properly funded research team, and a small miracle of timing to finally document a process that dry lake beds across this same desert region have been performing for millennia, the same broad landscape, the same climate, the same kind of playa terrain that stretches across the Colorado Plateau and into the edges of tribal land itself, where ranchers like Tom Begay had been finding these trails, undocumented and unexplained by outside science, for generation after generation. So ask yourself the obvious question. If it took the best resourced scientific institutions in the country over 100 years and a small amount of luck to catch this phenomenon in the act, what exactly should we assume about the people who had been living alongside it the entire time, watching the same rocks, the same trails, the same desert floor, for far longer than any research grant has ever existed? Let's go back to Tom Begay, standing over that boulder and its 60-foot scar in the clay. He isn't going to call anybody about it. Not a park ranger, not a university, not a reporter looking for a strange local interest story. And it isn't because he doesn't understand what happened. It's closer to the opposite. In a landscape where a mountain itself is remembered as something that once moved and chose to stop, a single boulder sliding a few dozen feet across a dry lake bed simply isn't the emergency an outsider would assume it to be. It's a small, familiar echo of something much larger the culture has always understood: that stone on this land is not always as still or as separate from life as the rest of us have been taught to assume. That reframes the entire question we opened with tonight. For a century, when settlers, surveyors, and eventually scientists asked native communities across the desert Southwest to explain trails like this, the response they got back so often amounted to silence, or something close enough to it. And for a century, that silence got filed away as ignorance, as if the people living on this land, simply hadn't noticed what was happening under their own boots. What actually happened is almost the reverse. The framework for understanding a rock that moves on its own was already fully built, generations deep, encoded into the story of a mountain that had done exactly that before finally choosing to stay put. Meanwhile, the outside world spent over 100 years treating the exact same phenomenon as an open scientific puzzle, one that ultimately required a research grant, a GPS array, and no small amount of patience to finally resolve. And even then, only for one particular stretch of desert, while similar trails kept quietly appearing across the wider region without anyone from outside ever bothering to ask the people who'd been watching it happen the whole time. There's something almost humbling in that comparison once you sit with it. An entire modern scientific apparatus, funding committees, GPS satellites, years of patient fieldwork, was required to catch nature doing, in slow motion, something a culture had already folded into its origin story generations before anyone owned a camera capable of proving it. That's not a knock against the scientists. Their work was careful, honest, and genuinely difficult. It's simply a reminder of how much certainty we tend to assign to the method of discovery, and how little credit we tend to give to knowledge that arrived by a different road entirely. Tom picks up a loose stone from beside the trail, turns it over once in his hand, and sets it back down exactly where he found it. He doesn't take a picture. He doesn't leave a marker. He just walks back to his truck, the way his grandfather would have, unsurprised, unbothered, and in no particular hurry to explain any of it to whoever might come asking next. Because if there's one thing this land keeps proving, video after video, story after story, it's that the people who've lived here the longest were never confused about what was moving beneath their feet. They simply decided, a long time ago, that some things don't need to be explained to be understood, and they were willing to let the rest of us take our own 100 years to catch up. If you want the real history behind stories like this one, the kind that never makes it into the tourist brochure, make sure you're subscribed, because next week, we head back into that same desert, and what we find there connects to almost everything you just watched.